The moment the protagonist raised the red flag, the system rewarded him with strength. His red flag points increased. His authority expanded. And for one brief second, it looked like he had gained another clean victory. But then, the hidden scenario opened. The King's Path. Difficulty A. 10 stations in 10 days. A reward called the King Attribute. And a failure penalty so brutal, it turned every breath in the station cold. If he failed to occupy at least one station per day, everyone under his command would die. Not just him, not just the fighters, everyone. The red flag was no longer a symbol of victory. It was a countdown, painted in blood. To understand why that red flag mattered, we have to go back to the end of the third main scenario. Emergency defense should have been a battle of intervals, waves, and preparation. Instead, every green zone collapsed, and the monsters poured out all at once. The survivors fought until the station became a ruin of broken bodies, burned air, and exhausted silence. When the completion reward arrived, it felt less like a prize and more like proof that they were still alive. Yu Jung-hyuk was unconscious. Lee Ji-hai was badly injured. Gil Youngi shook from what he had seen. The barrier around the theater dungeon lifted, revealing a soul that looked like it had been chewed apart by the sky itself. Then meteors began to fall. Beautiful, quiet, almost peaceful, but the protagonist knew better. In this world, shooting stars were not wishes. They were warnings. Wherever they landed, new disasters would bloom. The protagonist had one advantage that made him terrifying: knowledge. But after the third scenario, even that advantage began to feel unstable. The Constellations watched from above with wealth, power, and endless curiosity. Yet they were not all-knowing. Some truths were filtered. Some names were censored. Even messages from powerful beings could arrive broken, incomplete, or locked behind payment. He began treating the channel like a battlefield of information, allowing only messages that paid enough to be worth the risk. But the deeper problem was probability. If certain facts were too heavy for the scenario, the world itself seemed to resist their disclosure. Even a secret note meant for Yu Jung-hyuk had to be handled carefully. Would the Constellations see it? Would it be censored? Would the wrong person read it before the right person woke up? In this world, knowledge was not just power. Knowledge was bait. The fourth scenario did not begin with a monster. It began with politics. Chung-maru needed a representative, and the system disguised that selection as an election. But there were no speeches, no morality, and no fairness. The winner would be whoever captured the central flag and survived the timer. The crowd was already hostile, shouting for answers, and demanding the protagonist explain himself. Gong Pil-do wanted the position to protect his own territory and escape being controlled by someone else. But while everyone fought over fear, the protagonist watched the rules. Then he moved. Without grand declarations, he took the white flag. The right of command activated. If no one stole the flag within 5 minutes, Chung-maru would become his. Gong Pil-do resisted with armed zone, but the protagonist had already turned the board. Lee Hyun-sung's defense protected the group. The turrets were ordered down, and when the countdown ended, the station recognized a new representative. Taking Chung-maru did not magically make people loyal. It only made them accountable. The protagonist stood before the survivors and gave them a choice. Leave and take your chances elsewhere, or stay and live under my command. It sounded harsh, but it was cleaner than pretending everyone was family. He would not charge rent like the old tyrants. He would not exploit them for survival fees. But if they stayed, they had to accept that his rules protected the station. He also approached Hee-won with the same uncomfortable honesty. Their partnership would not be a romantic fantasy or blind friendship. It would be a deal. His knowledge for her strength. But beneath that practical exchange was something more fragile. Trust. He admitted that the future was no longer fixed. New variables were appearing, new prophets, unknown enemies, possibly even other readers. In that uncertainty, trust became both the most dangerous weakness and the only reason they had survived so far. When the fourth main scenario officially opened, the rules sounded almost childish. Capture the flag. Every station had a flag and a flagpole. Defend yours, take theirs. Plant your flag on enemy ground. But the simplicity was a trap. A captured station did not merely lose an object. Its people fell under the authority of the conqueror. The target was Changsin Station, and the time limit created pressure across the entire subway network. The safety barriers between stations dropped, and for the first time, movement was possible. That meant opportunity, but it also meant invasion. The protagonist divided the group. Some would scout ahead, others would remain behind to defend Chungmuro. Gong Pildu, the former enemy, was asked to guard the station not as a slave, but as a man whose obsession with territory could finally be useful. The scenario had shifted. Survival was no longer about hiding in one place. It was about moving before someone else moved first. The first real crisis of the fourth scenario arrived like a blade in the dark. A wall shattered. Li Jihei cried out for her master. A long-coated attacker moved with terrifying precision, and the truth hit harder than any sword strike. Yu Junghyuk was under mind control. For most enemies, the protagonist could calculate a weakness. But Yu Junghyuk was different. He was a regressor, a survivor of repeated lives, a man whose instincts were sharpened by death itself. Even controlled, even incomplete, he was overwhelming. Hee-won activated her judgment. Gil Youngi called down lightning. But Yu Junghyuk's resistance swallowed the electricity, and the attacker kept moving. Then a character list revealed the scale of the problem. Rare attributes, exclusive skills, sword techniques, and a new stigma that could recover powers from previous lives. This was not just an ally turned enemy. This was a future disaster waking up early. The protagonist hated using it, but hesitation would kill everyone. He consumed the Tyrant R-Rex DNA ampule. In an instant, his body surged beyond its normal limits. Vitality, strength, agility, mana, all of it spiked for 30 minutes. Pure star energy erupted around him, crawling across his body and soared like blue-white lightning. He knew he could not match Yu Junghyuk's skill, not truly, but the level gap had narrowed enough for one desperate window. The battle became a collision of borrowed power and inherited talent. The fourth wall flickered under immersion. The enemy's control tightened. Yu Junghyuk's swordsmanship kept improving even while his mind was chained. So the protagonist layered everything he had. Unbreakable faith, flame ether, pure star energy, a Constellations' unpredictable song of the sword. The battlefield turned into a storm of arrows, gunfire echoes, lightning, and flame. And finally, after all that pressure, the protagonist landed a strike that made the controlled monster stagger. Then, the battle changed shape. A mustached man in a hat stepped forward, with the calm of someone who believed the stage belonged to him. His eyes glowed red, and his skill activated. Mind erosion. This was not a wound that could be blocked with armor. It attacked thought, identity, memory, and the fragile border between a person and the story crushing them. Black tendrils curled around the protagonist as pain ripped through his head. But when the mental attack dug deeper, it found something impossible. Words appeared. Fragments of a ruined world. 3 ways to survive. Dokebi. A story that should not have been visible to the attacker. The fourth wall activated. The protagonist's mind did not collapse. Instead, the attacker recoiled, confused by the very narrative he had tried to invade. In that split second, the protagonist swung. The theater owner's simulacrum was defeated for the first time. Coins poured in. Hidden conditions unlocked. But before relief could settle, a grade 6 Titanoptera appeared, reminding them that victory in this world only changed the shape of the next threat. The next enemy did not crawl out of a dungeon. It rode in on motorcycles. Myeongdong Station breached Chungmuro with speed, weapons, and confidence. Their representative, Kim Hyun-tae, activated the red flag, and a visible surge moved through his people. Attack and defense rose across the entire faction. That detail changed everything. Flags were not decorations. They were engines of collective power. A white flag was only the beginning. Red, blue, brown, purple, and finally black. Each upgrade meant stronger effects, stronger authority, and more reason for representatives to kill each other. Myeongdong charged for Chungmuro's flagpole, believing momentum would decide the battle. But the protagonists saw the flaw immediately. They were running into prepared territory. And in Chungmuro, prepared territory belonged to Gongpildu. The battle inside Chungmuro turned brutal fast. Red energy beams tore through the contested zone. Civilians ran, fighters fell, retreat routes were blocked. The protagonist activated unbreakable faith and shifted his ether to flame. preparing to cut through the chaos. But the center of the defense was Gong Pildu. Armed Zone Level 6. Private Land Level 6. The man who once tried to dominate Chungmuro now became its wall. His territory control transformed the station into a trap where reckless invaders paid for every step. When the battle ended, the protagonist held the Myeongdong flag. The system absorbed its benefits. His basic flag evolved into a red flag. Now the buff applied not only to him, but to everyone under his command. It was a major power increase. But the victory came with a question that bothered him more than the bodies. How had Myeongdong known exactly when to attack? The protagonist needed answers, and mercy could not come before survival. A captured enemy was dragged in and threatened with a glowing blade. The man broke under pressure and revealed the name Dongmyo Station. Then came the word that changed the entire investigation. Prophets. These prophets had given information about Chungmuro to Myeongdong. But the captive could not explain everything. Secrets were being controlled, mouths were sealed, threads restrained those who might leak too much. The protagonist pieced together the method. Suggestion. A psychological skill that could influence information flow, but only if the target had seen the user's face. That limitation was the first real weakness in the prophet's strategy. If they could identify who had been exposed, they might identify at least one prophet. But the enemy's caution was terrifying. They did not simply gather information. They shaped who could speak, what could be remembered. The protagonist searched ways of survival for the word prophets and found nothing. That absence was louder than a warning. If prophets were active now, then only a few explanations made sense. One possibility was that a new prophet had appeared. Someone other than Anna Croft. Someone the known future had not accounted for. The other possibility was worse. Another reader existed. Another person who knew the story, or at least part of it, and was using that knowledge to interfere. The protagonist suspected this second reader had not reached the end. Their information was useful but incomplete. Dangerous precisely because partial knowledge creates reckless confidence. At Chungmuro, armed allies asked if their weapons would be enough. The protagonist answered with the mindset of a leader who had moved beyond fighting every battle himself. His role was not to swing first. His role was to decide where every weapon would matter. For a brief stretch, the threat was not a sword or a flag. It was the protagonist's own mind. Allies worried that the recent mental assault had left trauma behind. A companion warned him not to drown in his feelings, and the words hit harder than expected, because she was right. He was carrying too much. Secrets from the future, information leaks, responsibility for an entire station, and misunderstandings he could not easily correct. Then, the situation became absurdly personal. Talk of a baby, adoption, Yoo Jung-hyuk's eventual answers, and a love letter to an unknown master created a storm of confusion. The protagonist panicked internally, not because the situation was physically dangerous, but because too many people were hearing too much. Worse, the Constellations reacted like an audience watching drama unfold in real time. Some were shocked, some were amused, some sponsored coins. The protagonist wanted to curse every fool in the channel. In this world, even emotional vulnerability could become entertainment. The fate of the surviving Myeongdong members forced another ugly question. If the protagonist let them go, was that mercy or execution by distance? Wanderers without groups rarely survived. Other stations hunted them. The 5 Landlord Alliance members who once left Chungmuro had vanished quickly, proof that independence in this scenario was often just a slower way to die. A female ally admitted she had wanted to believe an alliance might work. The protagonist understood that feeling, because trust had saved him more than once. But trust was not something he could mass-produce. Most people were frightened. Many were compromised. Some were waiting for the right moment to betray. So leadership became a balance between hope and realism. Protect too blindly, and enemies enter the gate. Reject everyone, and the group becomes just another lonely corpse on the tracks. When the protagonist's group reached Myeongdong Station, they expected resistance. Instead, they found a massacre. Blood streaked the glass. Bodies lay inside and outside the station. The air felt too still for a place that had recently screamed. Armed men in tactical gear stood among the dead, calm enough to make the scene even worse. No faction seemed to occupy the station anymore. Whoever had done this had already left, and that detail disturbed the protagonist most of all. It felt as if the attackers had known his group was coming. Even he, with all his knowledge, did not understand what had happened. The others waited for answers, but for once there were none. Only blood, silence, and the suspicion that an unseen enemy was always one move ahead. The station was unoccupied. That single system detail turned horror into opportunity. The protagonist could not solve the massacre yet. He could not identify the armed men. He could not explain why the enemy had vanished ahead of them. But he could act. In the scenario, hesitation was often just another word for surrender. So he raised the red flag over Myeongdong Station. The system recognized the occupation. Chungmuro and Myeongdong were now both under his control. Once a station was occupied, it could not be stolen unless his flag or base station was taken. It was a powerful gain, but the blood around him made the victory feel poisoned. He had acquired territory, yes, but he had also inherited whatever nightmare had emptied it. Then the system delivered the real consequence. His red flag points increased, his power rose, and the hidden scenario opened like a trapdoor beneath his feet. The king's path. To clear it, he had to occupy at least 10 stations within 10 days. The reward was the king attribute, a title whose full power remained unknown but clearly stood above ordinary representatives. The failure condition was absolute. If he failed to meet the occupation requirement, the protagonist and his entire group would die. The scenario had changed again. This was no longer a defensive struggle. It was a campaign of conquest under a death clock. Every day demanded a new station. Every station meant new enemies. The prophets were still hidden. Another reader might be moving. Yu Jong-hyuk had not fully returned. Unknown armed factions had already proven they could massacre a station and disappear. And now, with 2 stations under his flag, the protagonist had stepped onto the road where every king candidate would either rule, kill, or be buried. The hellish scenario had officially begun.